200,000. That is the number most historians agree on. 200,000 women and girls, the youngest documented at 12 years old, forced into a system of industrialized sexual slavery by the Imperial Japanese Army between the early 1930s and the end of World War II. Approximately 80% of them were Korean. Many were taken from their homes, their schools, their villages, with promises of factory work or nursing jobs. They were told they would earn money to help their families. They were told they would return in 3 years. They never returned as the same person. Some never returned at all. To understand how this was possible, how a modern military apparatus could build, staff, and operate more than 400 sexual slavery stations across an entire continent for over a decade, involving hundreds of thousands of victims. You have to understand what Korea was in the 1930s and 40s. You have to understand what it meant to be colonized. Korea had been formally annexed by Japan in 1910, following decades of increasing Japanese interference that began with the forced Treaty of Ganghwa in 1876. By the time the comfort women system was fully operational, Korea had been under Japanese colonial rule for over 30 years. The Government General of Korea, based in Seoul, controlled every aspect of Korean life. Korean land had been systematically confiscated through the Land Survey of 1910 to 1918. Korean language was being phased out of schools. Korean names were being forcibly replaced with Japanese ones under the Soshikaime policy beginning in 1939. The Korean people were subjects of the Japanese Empire, not citizens, but resources. And among those resources, the most expendable were poor girls from rural provinces. The comfort women system did not emerge from nowhere. It evolved. Japanese military authorities had experimented with regulated military prostitution as early as the First Sino-Japanese War in 1894, but the system became institutionalized after the Nanjing Massacre of 1937, when the mass rape of Chinese women by Japanese soldiers created such international backlash and such severe outbreaks of venereal disease within the ranks that the military command decided it needed a controlled solution. The solution was comfort stations. The logic was bureaucratic. An internal Japanese army document from 1942, discovered decades later by historian Yoshiaki Yoshimi at the Defense Agency Library in Tokyo, confirmed that the military was directly involved in the establishment, management, and regulation of these stations. They set the tariffs. They determined the hours. They established hygiene protocols. They treated human trafficking as a logistics problem. Recruitment in Korea operated through a system designed to exploit the vulnerability of the colonized. In many cases, local village headmen, police officers, or Korean brokers working under Japanese authority would approach families. The targets were almost always poor families with multiple daughters and no sons. The pitch was always the same: factory work, hospital work, service to the war effort. Sometimes the language was more coercive. Kim Bok-dong, born in Yangsan, South Gyeongsang Province, in April 1926, was 14 years old when Japanese authorities came to her village in 1941. According to her repeated testimony, given first in 1992, then at the World Human Rights Conference in Vienna in 1993, then before journalists and lawmakers in Tokyo and Washington over the following decades, she and her mother were told that Kim would be taken to work in a military clothing factory. The implicit threat, as Kim recounted, was that refusal would mark her family as traitors. Her mother signed a document. Kim left home. She did not go to a factory. She was taken to a comfort station in Guangdong Province, China. From there, over the next 8 years, she was trafficked to stations in Hong Kong, Malaysia, Sumatra, Indonesia, Singapore, and Burma. Wherever the Japanese military advanced, the comfort stations followed, and the women were moved with the front lines like equipment. According to Kim's testimony, on weekdays, she was forced to service approximately 15 soldiers per day. On Saturdays, the soldiers would begin lining up at noon, and the line would not end until 8 in the evening. On Sundays, from 8 in the morning to 5 in the afternoon. Each soldier took roughly 3 minutes. Many kept their boots on. Kim described the experience in an interview decades later with a single devastating clarity. After the first year, she said, they were just like machines. The physical consequences were permanent. Kim Bok-dong was never able to have children. She attributed this directly to the years of repeated sexual violence. She lived with chronic pain for the rest of her life and required daily medication. But the physical toll was only part of the destruction. The psychological architecture of the comfort station was designed to annihilate identity. Women were given Japanese names. Kim became someone else inside those walls. They were forbidden from speaking Korean. They were forbidden from leaving. They were told that if they tried to escape, they would be killed. And this was not an empty threat. According to testimony collected from multiple survivors and compiled in the anthology Voices of the Korean Comfort Women, edited by Chung-Moo Choi and Hyuna Yang, women who resisted were beaten severely. One survivor, identified by the pseudonym Sunman Na, who was taken to Japan at the age of 12 in 1941, testified that she bit the faces of soldiers who attacked her, tearing flesh with her teeth. One of those soldiers twisted her arm until it broke. She lived with a permanently crooked arm for the rest of her life, unable to raise it above her head. Another survivor, recorded in the Korea Verban Testimonial Archive, identified only as Grandmother An, was born on January 2nd, 1928, in the Mapo district of Seoul. In the fall of 1942, at the age of 13, she was abducted by truck in Mapo and transported to China. She returned to Seoul in 1946, 1 year after Japan's defeat and Korea's liberation. She never married. She lived, as the archive states, constantly alone. She was 13. The scale of the system was not a secret during the war. Allied forces encountered comfort stations throughout the Pacific Theater. On August 14, 1944, a date that would take on different significance decades later, members of the United States Army's Myat Kaina task force in Burma captured 3 Korean comfort women. The photograph taken that day, now held in the U.S. National Archives, shows 3 young women standing beside American soldiers, their expressions unreadable. A U.S. military intelligence report, filed around the same period, known as Report Number 49, documented interviews with 20 Korean comfort women captured in Burma. The report described them as having been recruited under false pretenses, transported against their will, and held in conditions of sexual slavery. This document sat in the American archives for decades. It was not widely cited until historians began connecting the pieces in the 1990s. And this is where the story takes the turn that defines its true weight. Because the crime itself, as catastrophic as it was, is only half the story. The other half is the silence. When the war ended in 1945 and Korea was liberated, the women who survived the comfort stations returned home. Or tried to. In Confucian Korean society, a woman's chastity was considered more valuable than her life. An unmarried woman who had lost her virginity, for any reason, including kidnapping, slavery, and repeated rape, was considered impure. The cultural expectation, as documented by scholars including C. Sarah So in her work on post-colonial memory, was that such a woman should feel shame so profound that suicide was the honorable response. The survivors who chose to live made themselves outcasts by that very choice. Families rejected them. Communities shunned them. The survivor Yun Hong An, whose testimony is recorded in Voices of the Korean Comfort Women, returned home pregnant in 1945. Her family refused to take her in. Her entire village spread rumors about her. She was forced to give birth in a barn. She was called a tramp. She was called a bad girl. She was a teenager who had been kidnapped and systematically raped for years by an occupying military force, and she was called a bad girl. Kim Bok-dong returned to Korea at the age of 22. She told only her mother what had happened. Her mother, upon hearing the full account of what her daughter had endured for 8 years, suffered a heart attack and died. Kim carried the belief for the rest of her life that the pain of her secret had killed her mother. She did not speak publicly about her experience for nearly 50 years, and the governments, both Japanese and Korean, were content with the silence. Japan's official position for decades was that the comfort women issue had been resolved through post-war treaties, particularly the Treaty on Basic Relations between Japan and the Republic of Korea, signed in 1965, which normalized diplomatic relations and included economic cooperation funds that Japan characterized as settling all claims. The comfort women were never specifically mentioned in the treaty. They were erased by omission. South Korea, for its part, prioritized the diplomatic relationship and economic development over the suffering of women it had failed to protect. The survivors existed in a void, too shamed to speak, too politically inconvenient to be heard. This silence lasted 46 years. On August 14, 1991, a 67-year-old woman named Kim Hak-sun sat before the press and the nation and did what no Korean woman had ever done publicly. She testified. She described being taken at the age of 17 by a Japanese military officer and transported to a comfort station in China. She described the conditions. She described the violence. She described the decades of silence that followed. And she said something that would become the founding statement of a movement that has not stopped since. She said, "I am almost 70 years old, and I am not afraid of anything. I will say what I have to say." Kim Hak-sun's testimony did not happen in a vacuum. By the late 1980s, South Korea had transitioned toward democracy, and the women's rights movement was gaining ground. In 1990, the Japanese government had publicly stated that it bore no responsibility for the comfort women system, claiming the military had not been directly involved. This denial was the catalyst. Kim Hak-sun later said that she had watched the news, heard the Japanese government lying, and decided she could no longer remain silent. She was not asked to testify. She did it of her own will. The effect was seismic. Within months, other survivors began coming forward. In South Korea alone, 240 women would eventually register with the government as former comfort women. In December 1991, Kim Hak-sun and 2 other survivors filed a lawsuit at the Tokyo District Court demanding reparations and an official apology from the Japanese government. On January 8, 1992, 9 days before Japanese Prime Minister Kiichi Miyazawa's scheduled visit to South Korea, the Korean Council organized the first Wednesday demonstration in front of the Japanese embassy in Seoul. The survivors, activists, students, Buddhist monks, Catholic nuns, and ordinary citizens gathered and demanded 3 things: an official state-level apology, legal reparations, and the correction of Japanese history textbooks to include the truth of the comfort women system. 2 days after that first Wednesday demonstration, something extraordinary happened in Tokyo. Japanese historian Yoshiaki Yoshimi announced in the Asahi Shimbun newspaper that he had discovered documents in the Defense Agency library proving that the Imperial Japanese Army had been directly involved in establishing and operating comfort stations. The Japanese government could no longer deny its role. When Prime Minister Miyazawa arrived in Seoul, he expressed remorse. But the survivors wanted more than remorse from a visiting politician. They wanted an official state apology. What they got, after 2 more years of pressure, was the Kono Statement. On August 4, 1993, Chief Cabinet Secretary Yohei Kono released the results of a government investigation. The statement acknowledged that comfort stations had been operated in extensive areas for long periods. that the Japanese military was directly or indirectly involved in their establishment and management, and that women had been recruited against their own will through coaxing, coercion, and in some cases direct military participation. The statement extended what it called sincere apologies and remorse to all those who had suffered immeasurable pain and incurable physical and psychological wounds. For a brief moment, it seemed like the beginning of accountability. It was not. The Kono statement was issued by a cabinet secretary, not the Prime Minister. It was not accompanied by legislation. It was not followed by state reparations. Instead, in 1995, the Japanese government created the Asian Women's Fund, a nominally private foundation funded largely by government money, which offered individual payments to survivors. The distinction was deliberate, by routing the money through a private fund rather than the state budget. Japan maintained its legal position that all claims had been settled by previous treaties. Many survivors rejected the payments on principle. Kim Hak-sun, before her death from lung disease on December 16, 1997, made her position explicit. She said she had not come forward with her shameful past because of money. What she demanded was restitution, not consolation. And then the reversals began. In 2007, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe publicly stated that there was no evidence that women had been coerced by the Japanese military into working at comfort stations. This contradicted the Kono statement that his own government claimed to uphold. The statement drew international condemnation. The United States House of Representatives passed Resolution 121, calling on Japan to formally acknowledge, apologize, and accept historical responsibility in a clear and unequivocal manner. The European Parliament, the Canadian Parliament, the Dutch Parliament, and the Philippine House of Representatives passed similar resolutions. Japan dismissed them all. In December 2015, the governments of Japan and South Korea reached a bilateral agreement that was supposed to resolve the issue finally and irreversibly. Japan expressed apologies and remorse through Prime Minister Abe's statement and contributed 1 billion yen, approximately $8.3 million, to a foundation supporting surviving victims. The agreement was negotiated between two governments. The surviving comfort women were not consulted. When Kim Bok-dong heard the terms, she was unequivocal. She told a South Korean parliamentary session in 2016 that the survivors would not accept it, even if Japan gave 10 billion yen. It was not about money. The Japanese government was still saying that the women had gone to the comfort stations because they wanted to. Kim Bok-dong spent the last decades of her life in motion. She testified at international conferences. She traveled to Tokyo, to Washington, to Vienna. She participated in the Wednesday demonstrations in front of the Japanese embassy in Seoul nearly every week from 1992 until her health no longer permitted it. She and fellow survivor Gil Wanoke established the Butterfly Fund, an organization dedicated to supporting victims of wartime sexual violence around the world. Kim donated her life savings, 50 million won, roughly $45,000, to the fund. The symbolic name was her own idea. She said she wanted victims to be free from their hurtful past, like a butterfly coming out of its cocoon. She also made art. Beginning in 1992, while living at the House of Sharing, a shelter for former comfort women southeast of Seoul, Kim participated in an art therapy program. Her paintings documented her life in images. One was titled, "The Day a 14-Year-Old Girl is Stolen Away." Another was called, "As Youth Slips Away, Suddenly I Am Old and Grey." A third bore the title, "The Leaves of That Gaunt Tree Will Blossom Someday." She worked in paint, woodblock print, and pencil. Her artwork was included in campaigns and exhibitions around the world. On January 28, 2019, Kim Bok-dong died at the age of 93 in a Seoul hospital. In her final hours, she suddenly opened her eyes and spoke at length. Those at her bedside could not decipher everything, but one sentence came through clearly. They had to fight until the end. Her last stated wish was to receive a sincere apology from Prime Minister Abe. She did not receive it. Her funeral procession on February 1st drew thousands to the streets of Seoul. The route passed symbolically in front of the Japanese embassy. Hours before Kim died, another former comfort woman, identified only by her surname Lee, also passed away. 2 voices gone in a single day. The Wednesday demonstrations did not stop. They have never stopped. Since January 8, 1992, the protest has been held every single Wednesday at noon in front of the Japanese embassy in Seoul. The only Wednesday they ever missed was during the Great Hanshin earthquake in Japan in 1995. A gesture of solidarity with Japanese earthquake victims by the very women Japan had enslaved. In March 2002, the Guinness World Records recognized the Wednesday demonstration as the world's longest-running rally on a single theme. On December 14, 2011, in commemoration of the 1000th demonstration, a bronze statue was installed across from the embassy. The statue depicts a young girl sitting in a chair, her hands clenched in her lap, her feet not quite touching the ground. Beside her is an empty chair. The sculptors, Kim Seo-kyung and Kim Yoon-sung, said the empty chair was an invitation for anyone to sit beside her and share her burden. The Japanese government demanded the statue's removal. South Korea refused. The statue has been replicated in cities around the world, in Glendale, California, in San Francisco, in Berlin, in Sydney, in Shanghai. Each replica has been protested by Japanese officials. The statue of a teenage girl sitting in a chair has become one of the most politically contested monuments on Earth. Here is what the numbers look like as of 2026. Of the 240 South Korean women who officially registered as former comfort women, approximately 6 remain alive. All are over 90 years old. The Wednesday demonstrations have passed their 1700th session. In March 2026, a group of United Nations human rights experts issued a joint statement declaring that justice, truth, and reparations remain long overdue for survivors of the comfort women system. The statement noted that previous efforts, including the 2015 bilateral agreement, had failed to deliver survivor-centered justice. The experts urged all relevant states to act without further delay. The psychiatric research tells its own story. Studies conducted on surviving comfort women in South Korea, published in peer-reviewed journals, including the Journal of Korean Medical Science, found that survivors exhibited persistent symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder decades after their captivity. Their subjective well-being scores, measured on standardized scales, peaked before their abduction and dropped to their lowest during captivity. The scores never fully recovered. Not in the 1950s, not in the 70s, not in the 90s, not ever. The generic health status of the survivors, measured by the EQ-5D index, was significantly lower than the average for elderly women in South Korea. The trauma was not a chapter. It was a permanent condition. And perhaps the cruelest dimension of this story is the one that receives the least attention. The comfort women did not only suffer in the comfort stations. They suffered again when they came home. They suffered in the silence imposed on them by their own culture. They suffered in the decades when their own government chose diplomacy over their dignity. They suffered when the Japanese government offered money through a private fund instead of a state apology. And they suffered again when they were told the issue was resolved finally and irreversibly without anyone asking them whether they agreed. And they will suffer one final time when the last of them dies and the debate shifts from living testimony to historical interpretation, and politicians on both sides will be free to characterize the past without anyone left who can stand up and say, "No, that is not what happened." I was there. I was 13. Kim Hak-sun chose August 14th, 1991, to speak. Not because anyone chose that date for her, but because she chose it for herself. In 2012, the South Korean government declared August 14th the International Memorial Day for Comfort Women. The date now belongs to the world. But before it was a Memorial Day, before it was a symbol, before it was written into any official calendar, it was just a Tuesday in August, when a 67-year-old woman who had been silent for 46 years decided she was not afraid anymore. 200,000 women were taken. Most of them were never counted, never named, never found. The ones who survived carried the evidence in their bodies and in their silence. For 50 years, no government, no court, no institution asked them what had happened. And when they finally spoke, not because anyone invited them, but because they could no longer bear the sound of official denial, what they asked for was not money. It was not punishment. It was not revenge. They asked for one sentence spoken by the right person, in the right capacity, with the right weight of a nation behind it. A sentence that said, "We did this to you, and we are sorry." As of today, that sentence has not been spoken. The girl was 13 when they took her. She waited 50 years for someone to believe her. She is still waiting for an apology.